When I was young, I learned something that most people only discover after they have already paid for it. A system can look prosperous on the surface while quietly eating its own future underneath. That is one of the easiest mistakes in finance. People assume the damage begins when the panic begins. They think the crash is the beginning. Very often it is the opposite. The crash is merely the first moment when the bill is no longer being hidden. I have spent most of my life watching incentives. I do not start with slogans. I start with behavior. I ask a plain question: if I reward people for extracting value instead of building value, what kind of country do I get 20 years later? If I reward debt over patience, liquidation over stewardship, financial engineering over durable production, what exactly do I think will happen to jobs, homes, hospitals, and the future of a generation trying to enter adulthood? You can call it modern capitalism if you want. You can call it sophisticated finance. You can call it efficiency, liquidity, optimization, or shareholder discipline. I prefer simpler language. I prefer to look at what the machine actually does. And what this machine has increasingly done is take institutions that used to anchor American life, load them with debt, strip them for cash, and hand the downside to somebody else. The somebody else is usually the worker, the patient, the renter, the pensioner, the small town, the young graduate, the family farm, the person who cannot move, the person who cannot hire a lobbyist, the person who does not have the luxury of pretending that delayed consequences are not consequences. A lot of young people are told that their hardship is a personal failure. They are told they order too much takeout, buy the wrong coffee, pick the wrong major, expect too much, save too little, complain too often. I have never had much interest in comforting myths. Personal responsibility matters, discipline matters, living below your means matters. But there is another truth that matters just as much. If you build a system that monetizes every stable part of ordinary life, then no amount of motivational language will make that system benevolent. That is where I would begin if I were explaining the present moment. Honestly, a great many members of Gen Z are stepping into adulthood during the most expensive housing market they have ever seen, during a cost of living crisis, during a job market that looks weaker underneath than the headline language often suggests, and during a period when more and more of the country seems to be treated as something to be packaged, leveraged, and rented back to the people who used to think they might one day own a piece of it. A lot of people describe the result with one phrase: you will own nothing. The part they do not always say out loud is what comes next. If you own nothing, then every month becomes a toll, housing becomes a subscription, transportation becomes a subscription, software becomes a subscription, health becomes a subscription, convenience becomes a subscription. Even basic dignity begins to feel leased instead of held. When a society moves in that direction, young people do not merely start later, they start below water. If you want to understand how that happened, you have to go back before the buzzwords. You have to go back to the underlying structure. In the 1980s, private equity was often described more honestly than it is now. The phrase corporate raider existed for a reason. The language was harsh because the behavior was harsh. Leveraged buyout specialists were not admired for building quietly over 30 years. They were known for aggressive takeovers for debt, fueled acquisition tactics, and for the sort of financial maneuvering that could make a business appear richer to the acquirer while making the business itself more fragile. The mechanics were never as complicated as the packaging made them seem. Suppose a company needs $100 of support or restructuring or acquisition capital. A patient owner might put up $100, improve operations, wait, and accept the risk personally. The leveraged buyout model does something very different. The buyer may put up $10, borrow $90, and then attach that debt to the company itself. The burden does not sit where the decision was made. It sits inside the thing that has been bought. Now the company has to carry the weight that burden changes behavior immediately. Assets get sold, payroll gets cut, divisions get hollowed out, costs that were once tolerable become intolerable. Labor turns from a productive partner into an expense target. Long-term investment turns into a luxury maintenance, gets postponed. Service quality gets trimmed. Anything that can be reclassified as excess eventually gets treated as excess. And if the company survives long enough to look stable on paper, the process can turn even uglier. Another loan can be taken out, cash can be extracted. A dividend recapitalization can reward the financial sponsor while leaving the company with still more leverage. If the machine keeps running, the financial player can walk away enriched. If the machine breaks, bankruptcy can distribute the pain outward. That is one of the ugliest features of the structure. Gains are privatized, losses are socialized. People like to imagine that this is a niche corner of finance, some distant game among funds, consultants, and law firms. It is not. When the game grows large enough, it does not stay on Wall Street. It moves into shopping districts, medical staffing, rental lots, nursing homes, warehouses, payrolls, pharmacies, processing plants, towns, and households. It moves into the parts of life that ordinary people cannot opt out of. From the early buyout era onward, the numbers grew because the incentives were supportive. Banking regulations shifted, tax treatment favored debt. Junk bond markets expanded, capital became easier to raise for deals designed around leverage. After the first wave, the industry rebranded itself, but the rebranding did not change the underlying appetite. It simply made the appetite more respectable. Instead of relying only on the money of the deal makers, private equity firms increasingly raised funds from pensions, endowments, and other pools of capital belonging to institutions that ordinary people indirectly depended on. Then they borrowed the rest through banks and credit markets. The structure could therefore expand far beyond the limits of a single balance sheet. Risk kept moving outward while control remained concentrated. That is how an industry grows from a reputation for raiding into a position of structural influence. Today, the scale itself should make people stop and think. The largest firms do not merely own stakes in companies. They command pools of capital and debt so large that they can influence housing, healthcare, labor conditions, and access to opportunity in ways that no ordinary voter can counter in his daily life. Now, if that power had been used with extreme discipline, one might argue that some of it was justified. Capital allocation matters. Improving bad businesses matters. Some companies need better ownership, better controls, better incentives, better management. I do not deny any of that. But when a tool designed for occasional surgical intervention becomes a default operating philosophy for whole sectors, the social result changes. You no longer have isolated restructurings, you get widespread extraction, and if you want to see what extraction looks like in practical terms, begin with employment. Between 2009 and 2019, more than 1 million Americans lost retail jobs as a result of private equity takeovers, according to the figures cited in the source material. Toys R Us became the symbol because symbols matter. A familiar brand carried more than $5 billion in debt, and over 33,000 workers ultimately lost their jobs. The public usually sees the closing sale, the empty shelves, the sad photographs of a once familiar chain. The public does not always see the sequence of incentives that made the outcome more likely long before the liquidation signs went up. A debt-loaded company has less room for error. It has less room for weak quarters, less room for changing consumer demand, less room for reinvestment, less room for patience, less room for experimentation, less room for people. Gen Z happens to be entering adulthood at a moment when these pressures matter more, not less. Younger workers are especially dependent on entry-level work, on service work, on retail work, on the kinds of jobs that often exist closest to the margin. If those jobs are the first to be stripped, automated, consolidated, or bankrupted, the pain does not arrive in theory. It arrives in the beginning of a career, which is where compounding either starts or fails to start. That matters more than most people admit. A weak beginning is not just a weak beginning. It becomes less savings, less mobility, less confidence, less bargaining power, more debt dependence, and more vulnerability to the next shock. Many people talk about underemployment as if it were an inconvenience. For a young person, it can become an entire trajectory. The source material cited a troubling figure in the consumer discretionary sector. Private equity-backed companies accounted for more than 71% of the largest bankruptcies in 2025. In manufacturing, the figure cited was roughly 60%. Whether one focuses on the exact percentages or the broader direction, the message is the same. The areas that should be providing durable work and productive capacity are increasingly exposed to structures that favor financial exit over institutional stamina. There is also a cited estimate that the average leverage buyout results in an 18% reduction in wages. That is the part many people miss. You do not need a dramatic layoff headline to suffer extraction. You can suffer it slowly. Hours can change, raises can vanish, staffing can thin, responsibilities can widen, benefits can erode, training can disappear. The experience of work can become poorer even before the job disappears. A society can therefore grow more insecure without always looking instantly catastrophic. Then move from jobs to housing, because housing is where the generational consequences become impossible to ignore. The United States is described in the source as facing a shortage of roughly 5 million homes and 7.2 million affordable and available rental units. In that kind of shortage, any large institutional buyer with cheap capital organization and patience can exert enormous pressure. A normal family sees a starter home, a large fund sees yield, scarcity, and an opportunity to control access. That difference matters. Instead of simply helping to close the shortage in a way that restores ownership, some major firms have expanded into building entire communities for rent. Built-to-rent homes have risen sharply since 2019. And in the cited material, they account for a rapidly growing share of single-family housing starts. Think carefully about what that means. The single-family form, which used to symbolize stability and accumulation for an owner, is increasingly being adapted into a product format for institutional cash flow. A house becomes an asset class before it becomes a home. That is not just an aesthetic change, it is a change in who captures the upside appreciation. Optionality and tax advantages sit with the owner. The monthly burden, maintenance anxiety, and uncertainty sit with the renter. If a generation gets locked on the wrong side of that line, wealth does not merely grow more slowly, it grows elsewhere. The same process has moved into one of the last remaining forms of relatively affordable housing: manufactured homes and the parks beneath them. The source material cited that institutional investors accounted for 23% of all manufactured home park purchases in 2020 and 2021. It also cited that 23 private equity firms controlled more than 1,800 parks and over 400,000 lots across the country. In Michigan alone, roughly a quarter of manufactured housing was described as being owned by private equity, with rents on lots rising by more than 45%. That is a brutal sentence, because it captures one of the most cynical forms of power in modern finance. A manufactured home can look like ownership, but if someone else controls the land under it, the owner is often trapped. Moving the home may be expensive or unrealistic. Selling can be difficult. Walking away can destroy the household. The landlord therefore has leverage that is not merely economic. It is structural. It is geographic. It is psychological. It sits in the fact that the person paying cannot easily leave. When people speak about rising rents, they often picture luxury towers or trendy neighborhoods. They should also think about captive affordability, the form of housing that people choose precisely because they are trying to survive. Once extraction moves into the refuge stops being a refuge. The source made another point that deserves to stay with anyone who still thinks this is abstract. First-time homebuyers are at their lowest level in nearly 50 years by the cited claim, and Gen Z is projected to spend roughly $145,000 on rent by age 30. That number is not just money gone, it is down payment capital gone, it is household formation delayed, it is optionality lost, it is bargaining power weakened, it is fertility decisions altered, it is geographic choice constrained, it is a future sold back in monthly installments. And then the same logic appears again in healthcare. People like to think that certain sectors will remain partially sacred because human need is too obvious to ignore. That is a comforting thought. But markets do not naturally stop where suffering begins. They stop where incentives stop, and if incentives do not stop, suffering gets reorganized into a line item. The source material stated that private equity has invested well over $1 trillion in U.S. healthcare over the past decade across hospitals, behavioral health, nursing homes, ambulance services, and medical staffing. The word invested sounds constructive. Sometimes it is. But in this case, the pattern described is more troubling. Essential systems are acquired, loaded, optimized, and pressured under debt, and cost targets that do not care very much about the fragility of the patient on the other side of the spreadsheet. The source cited researchers linking private equity ownership of hospitals to a 13.4% increase in emergency department death, a 2.7% rise in 30-day postoperative mortality, nearly 18% salary cuts, and an 11.6% drop in full-time emergency department staffing. It also cited roughly 27% higher falls and 38% more central line infections at private equity-owned hospitals, along with higher mortality and infection rates at nursing homes tied to chronic understaffing. When I read numbers like that, I do not think first about ideology. I think first about incentives. If the easiest way to make the acquisition look better is to cut labor, and the labor being cut is the labor standing between a patient and disaster, then the spreadsheet has become more important than the mission. That is the real moral failure. It is not merely that money is being made. Money will always be made. It is that the structure rewards people for degrading the reliability of institutions that people depend on at their weakest moments. You can tolerate a mediocre toy store, you cannot tolerate a mediocre emergency department, and yet the same logic spreads. The source noted that private equity-owned companies accounted for 44% of the largest healthcare bankruptcies in 2025 and 88% in 2024. At the same time, nearly a quarter of Gen Z was described as already skipping recommended medical treatment due to rising costs. So the same generation that is priced out of ownership and weakened in the labor market is also being pushed toward delayed care. That is how one vulnerability talks to another. A weaker job market means weaker insurance, weaker savings, weaker ability to absorb a surprise bill. Delayed treatment means worse outcomes, more chronic problems, less productivity, more instability. These are not isolated burdens, they compound. And then the logic moves again, this time toward food. A great many people still imagine the food system as if it were separate from modern finance, as if farms and processing and distribution somehow live outside the incentives that have consumed everything else. That is wishful thinking. Wherever there is cash flow, debt can find it. Wherever there is distress, leverage can find it. Wherever there is essential demand, someone will try to dominate the channel. The source described severe consolidation already present in meatpacking and noted that private equity has moved into leveraged buyouts involving struggling family farms, stripping operations, and then selling remaining assets to dominant processors. It also noted that 99% of farmed animals in the United States are now raised in factory farm conditions. I am not using this part of the story to make a sentimental detour. I am using it because it reveals the consistency of the machine. It does not simply chase software or real estate or hospitals or retail. It chases any system in which real dependence can be converted into financial leverage. Jobs depend on it, food depends on it, health depends on it, shelter depends on it. That is why young people feel cornered even when they cannot always explain the full mechanism. They may not have a model of leveraged buyouts, debt overhang, or shadow banking, but they know what it feels like when everything necessary becomes harder to touch, less secure to keep, and more expensive to lose. Then there is private credit, which pushes the story from extraction into fragility. A lot of people hear the term private credit and imagine something technical, distant, perhaps even healthy, because it sounds like an alternative to traditional banking. Sometimes alternatives are healthy, sometimes they fill genuine gaps, but you have to watch what happens when a useful tool becomes a giant reservoir of lightly visible risk. The source material described private credit as a market exceeding $3 trillion, roughly double the size of the subprime lending market that helped trigger the 2008 financial crisis. It described loans being made outside the traditional banking system, often by private equity firms, asset managers, and specialized lending funds, frequently to companies that were already bought using debt in the first place, that should immediately make a careful person uneasy when the same broad ecosystem first loads businesses with debt and then refinances that debt through a less regulated credit channel. The distinction between funding and concealment begins to blur. You are no longer simply solving a financing need. You are extending the lifespan of assumptions that may no longer deserve to live. The source described the market as part of shadow banking, with less regulatory oversight, weaker lending standards, and optimistic assumptions about future growth used to justify large debt loads. It also noted recent withdrawal limits on a private credit fund after redemption requests exceeded liquidity. That matters because liquidity is honesty in motion. As long as money flows in, paper values can pretend. As long as refinancing remains easy, trouble can remain theoretical. As long as investors agree not to ask for their cash at the same time, an illiquid system can act civilized. But once redemption pressure rises, the truth begins to surface, not always all at once, sometimes only in glimpses, but those glimpses matter. They tell you where the structure is brittle. The source went further and linked the private credit expansion to the possibility of a wider credit bubble, to a situation in which analysts were warning that if defaults accelerate, a poorly visible lending structure could become the next major crisis. This is exactly the sort of thing that worries me more than an obvious bubble. An obvious bubble gets mocked, a disguised bubble gets financed, and if you want the final insult in the structure, remember who may absorb the fallout. The same government that would be expected to stabilize the system in a deeper emergency is already carrying unprecedented debt burdens. So the burden keeps rolling forward. Debt moves to companies. Companies fail. Systems strain. Public authorities intervene. Inflation or future taxation or degraded public services absorb another part of the cost. Young people inherit the residue. That is how a generation receives a bill for decisions it did not make. I understand why so many younger people use apocalyptic language. I understand why they talk about being sold out, hollowed out, priced out, and reduced to subscribers in a country that once promised builders they might become owners. Those phrases are emotional, but they are not irrational. They are an attempt to describe a pattern in which nearly every part of ordinary life feels monetized by somebody with more leverage than accountability. And what makes the pattern even more dangerous is that none of these areas need to be an absolute collapse for the effect to be devastating. You can destroy the confidence of a generation without an official catastrophe. You only need enough instability, enough extraction, enough upward redistribution, and enough monthly obligations to make the horizon disappear. If a young person believes that every stable rung is being removed, his behavior changes, he delays. He consumes comfort because the future feels abstract. He avoids marriage, he avoids children, he avoids risk, he stops trusting institutions, he stops believing ownership is plausible, he looks for short-term relief because the long-term ladder appears to be controlled by someone else. That is not a character defect. It is partly a rational response to a system that keeps converting foundations into fees. Now, I do not want to pretend that every problem in American life begins and ends with private equity. That would be too simple. Bad policy matters, poor monetary choices matter, cultural habits matter, household behavior matters, speculation matters, political cowardice matters. Plenty of people damage their own lives without needing a buyout firm to help them. But there is a reason this particular subject has such force when you follow it across sectors. It reveals an operating philosophy. The philosophy says that if an institution can bear more debt, it should. If a cost can be cut, it should be. If a public weakness can be financialized, it should be. If a future cash flow can be pulled into the present, it should be. If a burden can be shifted to the less powerful side of the transaction, it will be. And if the whole thing becomes unstable, the people closest to the decision often have more ways out than the people left inside the structure. That is why so much of the anger feels moral, not just economic. People do not merely object to inequality. They object to asymmetry of consequence. The people building the fragile systems do not stand in the same line as the people trapped under them. A pension can be liquidated from millions down to almost nothing after years of financial engineering and bankruptcy. A manufactured home resident can be asked what her plan is after another rent jump and answer, with heartbreaking exhaustion, that she hopes not to wake up tomorrow. A worker can spend years doing everything he was told to do, only to find that the institution he trusted was never run for endurance in the first place. These things happen, one story at a time. But the stories accumulate into a national balance sheet of distrust. At that point, the most dangerous temptation appears. The temptation is to conclude that because the system is corrupt, individual conduct no longer matters. That is the temptation I would resist with all the force I have. I have never believed that one person, one speech, or one video fixes a machine this large. It does not systems. With this much money, lobbying power, and political access do not retreat because someone points at them angrily. They retreat only when incentives change, law changes, behavior changes, capital changes, and enough people refuse to behave like passive inputs. But refusing passivity does not begin at the Federal Reserve. It does not begin at a law firm. It does not begin in a boardroom. It begins in a life. That is a point many people do not like because it sounds smaller than the scale of the problem. I understand that, but it is still true. If corruption becomes our excuse for not showing up in our own life, then corruption wins twice. A society is not rebuilt only by major policy reform. It is also rebuilt by standards, by habits, by examples, by small acts of ownership in places where no one is forcing ownership. A person who cannot yet stop a buyout fund can still stop living like nothing belongs to him. He can still practice stewardship, he can still create order, he can still become dependable, he can still care for shared space, he can still refuse the soul. Deadening habit of treating every environment like somebody else's problem, that sounds modest, but modest things compound. If one person pushes in the chairs long enough, eventually more chairs are pushed in. If one person keeps a place clean long enough, eventually more people notice the standard. If one person behaves as though life is still worth taking responsibility for, even in a corrupt environment, he creates proof that corruption is not omnipotent. I have always believed that examples are more powerful than lectures. Markets are examples, balance sheets are examples, households are examples. Character is an example. When enough examples stack, culture shifts. When culture shifts, politics shifts. When politics shifts, law can shift. When law shifts, incentives shift. The process is slower than anger wants, but it is more durable than rage alone. I am not saying that picking up a piece of trash defeats a private equity fund. I am saying that people who will not pick up a piece of trash are very unlikely to rebuild a civilization after the looters are done with it. Discipline is not a substitute for structural reform. It is a precondition for using structural reform. Well, hope works the same way. Many people think hope is denial. I have never seen it that way. False hope is denial. Real hope is disciplined participation before the scoreboard changes. It is showing up while the results still look unfavorable. It is acting like your conduct matters before the crowd agrees that it matters. There is a phrase about small ripples of hope. I think there is wisdom in that. Large systems often look immovable until they do not. They look permanent right up until the moment enough people stop granting them moral legitimacy, political protection, cultural deference, or cheap compliance. But even if none of that changed tomorrow, I would still say the same thing. Do not let a predatory system turn you into a hollow person. Do not let financial extraction train you to believe stewardship is naive. Do not let monthly pressure teach you that nothing can be built. Do not let the sight of corruption become permission to live carelessly. You may not control whether the country chooses another bailout. You may not control whether another fund limits withdrawals. You may not control whether a hospital chain, a rental operator, a nursing home owner, or a giant landlord gets more financing next quarter. You may not control whether a politician talks tough and does nothing. You may not control whether another family farm gets rolled up. You may not control whether another generation is told to lower its expectations. But you do control whether your own life becomes fully organized around reaction. That matters because reaction is exactly what a bad system wants from you. It wants exhaustion, it wants cynicism, it wants scattered attention, it wants resentment without discipline, It wants consumers, not builders. It wants renters in the broadest sense of the word, people merely passing through their own life paying fees to forces they never challenge and standards they never defend. I would rather live another way. I would rather tell the truth about the structure and still insist on agency. I would rather say plainly that private equity, private credit, housing extraction, healthcare stripping, and generational fragility are all parts of one story. A story about what happens when a society mistakes leveraged extraction for productive wealth. And I would also rather say that the answer is not theatrical despair. The answer begins with seeing clearly. The answer continues with refusing to participate blindly in what is hollowing you out. The answer continues again with rebuilding habits of ownership, restraint, stewardship, competence, and mutual regard in whatever corner of life is still yours to influence. A generation does not need to be told fairy tales. It needs to be told the stakes. The stakes are that if every foundational institution is treated like an asset to be mined, then eventually the nation itself starts to resemble a buyout target. It gets loaded with promises, drained for yield, stripped for parts, and left to ordinary people to carry the debt, the social decay, the weakened trust, and the ruined base. That is what young people sense when they say the future feels gutted, and yet the future is never shaped. Only by those who exploit weakness. It is also shaped by those who recognize weakness and decide not to imitate it. I have spent enough time around capital to know that money magnifies whatever values govern it. In the hands of builders, money can fund patience, employment, resilience, and invention. In the hands of extractors, money can turn every necessity into a toll booth. That is why this subject is not really about one firm, one asset manager, one fund, one housing operator, or one bad quarter. It is about the values embedded in the system and the willingness of a society to keep calling predation sophistication. The good news, if there is any good news in a hard subject, is that reality eventually forces recognition. Debt does not disappear because language gets softer. Understaffing does not become care because a presentation says efficiency. Rent extraction does not become opportunity because a brochure says community. A fragile loan does not become safe because it sits in a private fund. A generation priced out of stability does not become lazy because it is insulted on television. Reality wins in the end. The only question is how much damage gets done before enough people choose to stop lying about what they are seeing. If I were speaking to a young person trying to build a life in this climate, I would say this: do not confuse the sickness of the system with the value of your effort. Do not let a culture of extraction convince you that all discipline is pointless. Study incentives carefully. Guard your fixed costs brutally. Avoid structures that trap you. Save your liquidity. Treat debt with respect. Own what you can truly own. Be skeptical of institutions that prosper by making you permanently dependent. Learn the difference between appearance and durability. Learn the difference between yield and safety. Learn the difference between convenience and captivity. And when you find a place where you can still make things a little more orderly, a little more honest, a little more humane, do it. That is not small. That is the seed of recovery. Because the people who will eventually rebuild what has been hollowed out will not be the ones who learned only how to complain. They will be the ones who learned how to see clearly, live steadily, resist corruption in conduct as well as rhetoric, and create islands of reliability in a time addicted to extraction. That kind of person is always worth betting on. I know, because that kind of person is how every healthy compounding story begins.